Hello, everyone. My name is Vaida, and I'm here to take a quick look at microgames with you. So a little bit about myself. I make short experimental games, usually narrative-based things about like relationships and mental health. I do some front-end work, and I run the Game Development Society in Edinburgh. So it doesn't really make sense to just like throw a bunch of microgames at you and be like, please play these, even though you should like play Hot Date, which is about dating pugs. It's pretty cool, it's a funny game. So I should probably focus on a specific subset, and I want to talk about personal microgames, discuss the different uses they can have through a bunch of examples. And to give you an idea of what I mean by personal microgames, games like Morning Makeup Madness, where you have 10 seconds to like put on your makeup in the morning, and you have all these like tools that you can use, and you end up with like beautiful faces such as these. And games like Get Up, another game about having troubles getting up in the morning. And the description of this one is when you can't go get to sleep at night, so you make a game about the morning. So in this game, you kind of click arrow keys to try to move your character out of the bed, and like you get like little animations. But after some time, you realize like you can't actually get up. Like that's the whole point of the game, and so you can never leave the bed. So these two examples are like pretty limiting. It seems like there's not much to do, like they take only a few seconds to play. So how come super simple gameplay can be useful for personal games? Like it seems like there's very limited interactions you can have. So how can you communicate personal stories in something so limited? Well, that's because a lot can be achieved by combining things together, using a couple of very simple mechanics, adding them together, and they become more meaningful than the sum of their parts. So if we take an example, the brain is incredibly complex, but if you really look at the atomic parts of the brain, you have like neurons, and the other like simplest thing is like reflexes, and then like thought patterns, and then you can like build it up into like personality and so on. So the neurons are very simple, but when you build them into something more complex, you get the full complexity of like the human brain. So you can actually, similarly in games, communicate nuanced thought patterns and like dynamics through just a couple of like well-chosen mechanics. So the game that I feel is a good example of that is Lim. So as you can see, the graphics are very, very basic. You just have squares. And the actual gameplay is that you are in this maze, and certain rooms have other characters in them. You're the purple one. And you can use the arrow keys to move. And at some point, when you get to these other characters, they start pushing you. When they notice you, they start pushing you back into the maze. And you can use one button. You can use the Z button. You can hold it. What that does is it makes the color of your square match the color of the other squares. And when that happens, like they're fine with you. They don't bother you anymore. And so you can continue to progress through the maze. The problem with this, though, is that when you are holding the Z button, the screen starts to like contract towards you. There's like some white noise, a bit of like screen shake. So as you move while being kind of matching the color of the other squares, you kind of get the sense of discomfort, and you start seeing less, so you don't really know where you're going. And I feel like everyone can kind of imagine what this game is actually, like what themes is actually dealing about. But when we look at the actual mechanics around it, it's very simple. It's just certain like rooms have certain characters. It's like a simple mechanic of pushing the character away in just a few buttons. And there's no narrative. There's very limited mechanics. But the kind of main idea in this game that's really interesting is this kind of trade-off of having to choose whether to hold the Z button or whether to just kind of try to push through the maze by not holding it. And every person will kind of experience this differently. So I can imagine that some people would just kind of play the game and never realize that you can press the Z button because it's like only written in the description, I think. And so they might not really understand that aspect of the game. Or some other people might start the game by holding the Z button the whole way, and some others might kind of try and test. And so each person will kind of discover this mechanic in their own personal way. And another game that's very good at kind of showing that using a very few simple mechanics that are well put together work well is Queers in Love at the End of the World. So in this game, you are a queer. you are in love, and it happens to be the end of the world. And you have a few options that you can take. So you have that timer that just counts down from 10 seconds down to 0. And you can choose to kiss her, hold her, take her hand, or tell her. So when you make that choice, you get another paragraph with you can kiss her gently, kiss her angrily, and so on. And when you start playing this game, you're like, oh, okay, there's a counter. Okay, I need to click something. You make a choice, and then you realize you have more choices to make. And so then you're kind of faced with this choice of, do I read the paragraph and see what's going on and kind of think about what action I want to take? Or do I click through to get to the end to do as many actions as I can because I've only got 10 seconds to live? And so there's a sense of urgency that's created by something that literally just has text and a timer. And it really well represents the kind of endless space of possibility of living beings. And I think that's really cool. And so, kind of to summarize, when you're making a tiny game, you only really have a couple of minutes, sometimes a couple of seconds, to get the player's attention. So you cannot really afford complex systems. You cannot afford to distract the player and have lots of clutter, lots of mechanics. You have to really focus on those core few actions that the player can take. And figuring these out is actually really hard because you have to do a lot of boiling things down. So you can see making microgames as a form of practice, as a form of a design exercise where you have to deal with constraints. So let's look at the components of the few games I mentioned earlier and see how that actually works. So in this game, you have the instructions that are on the screen. They're large. There's a period at the end, and you can never actually get to them, so that makes you frustrated. Then you have the bed hair that is all over the place, and when you actually press the arrow keys, it makes a white noise, annoying white noise sound, and your character just kind of moves in bed and the hair goes all over. So again, it's a feeling of discomfort, and every single aspect of the game adds to the experience of frustration. Everything is kind of meant to go towards that, and you only have that one frame, and you have the bed and the character, which are the two kind of most important characters of the game. So that's one example of adding different mechanics together and different aspects that are only there for that kind of sole purpose. And then you have this game. I couldn't find a normal screenshot for it, but it's called Cigarettes, and it's another game about frustration. In it, the graphics are only this character, and then you have a pack of cigarettes, and then you have an anxiety bar at the top. And so when the game starts, the anxiety bar starts filling up, and your character starts sweating. And so you obviously go oh, okay, let's click on the pack of cigarettes. So you click on it, and the anxiety goes down by a bit, and then starts increasing again. And then the character starts sweating again, and you're well, there's only the pack of cigarettes on the screen, so what am I supposed to do? And you kind of try to click it several times, try to see what's happening, and you always get this kind of cycle. And actually, you can win this game by letting the character sweat out for I think 30 seconds and not click on anything at all. And that's how the anxiety starts decreasing. And you the idea is obviously that you kind of go over smoking. And what's interesting with this game is that it plays on frustration by not having anything on the screen but just the most important things, and the fact that you can't even avoid looking at the pack of cigarettes because it's just there, and then you have the anxiety that you have there, and then you have the character's avatar that's there and it's sweating, so you have no way of kind of avoiding that interaction, and you get frustrated because you can't figure out an answer. So that's that. And as to my own experience, I have made a bunch of these small micro games by doing one game a month for a bunch of time. And no matter whether the game was good or bad, I always felt I learned something to some extent. And that's kind of why I put here paint brushes on this slide, is because this kind of process of just kind of making small things and just trying them out kind of reminds me of Inktober. So if you're not familiar, during the month of October, artists decide to participate in this kind of community project thing that's called Inktober, where they make a small ink drawing for every day, for each day of October. And like some of these can be just like doodles, and some people decide to make like bigger kind of artworks or to practice like a specific skill. So let's say perspective or like character building, and you can kind of apply that to games. So when making these small micro games, it's a bit like participating in game jams like all of the time, except like it's on your own terms. Like, so you're able to kind of learn how to switch into game design mode better and get kind of a subconscious feel of what will work and what won't work. So you kind of get this recipe for making games slightly in an easier way for you. You become better at translating feelings into mechanics. And that I will talk about that later, because that's like a big part for me. And this design exercise, it can also have cathartic uses. And that's my next point, which is that when you kind of have an idea and something is really like bothering you, and you just are able to have these couple of hours where you just open like a tool and just kind of develop something really quickly, you're really focused, and you end up with something that represents your state of mind. So for example, you know, the problems with smoking or about getting up out of bed, and it kind of feels like you're processing that experience by thinking about what mechanics you should use, and by having this kind of finished product at the end that can be really helpful in terms of kind of processing it. And it doesn't have to be negative experiences either. Yeah. Well, this one obviously being quite a negative experience. The only point I wanted to make about this is that the avatar is not just a little character that the author designed. It's like themselves in the game. And if you read the description of the game, it says, "I've picked up a bad habit." So it's like a first-person kind of thing. Video games about self-care are exactly what we need right now. So this is an article from Killscreen. There was a game jam called the Selfcare Jam that took place a while ago, and it was about making games about good experiences. It was about making healing games and focusing on positive thought loops while developing them. So, for example, there were some people that made games about self-care bots or about getting out of bed in the morning and having like a kind of self-care ritual in the morning, so kind of as a contrast to the previous games mentioned. And one of these games was, for example, Losing Control. It was a game where you just kind of walk around in this snowy environment, and you can interact with these burning objects, and each one of them kind of gives you a bit of the developer's thought process when it comes to depression. And the creator of this game has this quote, "I wanted to create this game as a reminder to myself that feeling bad isn't necessarily a bad thing, that those feelings have importance and that they aren't permanent." And obviously, you can see in that making the game was also a form of processing those experiences. But the part I want to focus on right now is creating this game as a reminder to myself, because games can also be used as snapshots. So when you're making personal games in a kind of regular way, so for example, each month or kind of, not like too often, kind of just regularly, I would usually, for example, have like a very short development cycle of just a few days from time to time. And what's weird is that when I play these games again, I can kind of clearly remember how I felt at that point in time when I was making them, because I literally just had like a weekend where I spent just like the full day making something, and that was it. And I'm able to kind of reflect better, because I'm not just like reading, let's say, a piece of poetry that I wrote or listening to a song I wrote. I'm able to like interact as a player with something that I made, and while I was making them for a player, and now I'm able to experience them as the player. And sometimes, especially if it's been a while since you've played a certain game of yours, sometimes the game like plays you, and like you forget that you put in certain features, and you're like, oh, I see what I did there. And and you kind of just have this interactive snapshot of every month of your life when I was doing one game a month. And you kind of start noticing inspirations from other games. You kind of realize the reason behind some design choices, because sometimes it feels like you just did something for the sake of doing it, but actually there was like a few layers of thought that you didn't realize you had. You were just kind of shaping it in a certain direction, and that might have not been obvious at the time that you were making it. And so the games become this interactive, lively diary of things, and yeah, you just notice so much more. And a personal example of this is this game I made called Where the Punk's At. I made this a while ago. So it's about running around, it's about kicking trash, it's about going to a punk show, being a rebel. And I love replaying this game, even though it's like really a terrible game, because it reminds me of an inside joke I had with a friend, because I started this game because of the fact that we started like talking about like weird game ideas, and we were like into discussing politics and stuff. And well, I remember clearly when I was making this game that I had this feeling of like, oh, I can just like, I've got enough skills to just open up an engine and make a game about an inside joke I had with a friend. Like, I have no problems in terms of skills. Like, I can just make it. And that feeling was very like empowering. And I feel like lots of it has seeped into the game because I can just feel every time I play it, I can just remember that and really feel it strongly. So that's like, it's interesting as a sort of snapshot of that period of my life. And that brings me to microgames as communication. So making games while being inspired by conversation with people and so on, it's interesting to think about games as being able to be used as like intermediaries, because if you're good at making games, if you've been making small games like for a while, you become better at translating feelings into mechanics. The games become kind of better suited for what you're trying to say. So there's no reason why you can't use a game as a sort of message to someone. And because of the fact that you're making very tiny things and it only takes a couple of hours of your time, you can usually afford a couple of hours from time to time to make something like that. And so you can use them as an intermediary. You can make a small game for a specific person to say something specific about you that it might be hard to say in words, but that you're kind of able to translate in mechanics. And it can often feel like you're able to say more and be more honest because of the fact that you're not directly telling them the things. It's like there's the game that you made and the player is playing the game and they're kind of interacting with the game and it's interacting back at them. So I feel like I'm able to kind of say things more directly because I'm not like properly like using like myself to like talk about them. And the idea of specific games for specific people, I find that really interesting. And that's just a screenshot of like a paper-based game that's just like a collection of like really old poetry I did, and it had some screenshots of like conversations with people and so on. And the idea was that I gave this to a person and they just kind of had to figure out the gameplay, which was like piecing my life back together and seeing like what kind of like arcs I had in my life. It was really weird, but it was just my way of being like, yo, I make things. I want to show you the things I make. Please play. Thank you. And it was interesting as an experiment. This is another example of how you can kind of communicate things. This is a game made during the Selfcare Jam, actually, called Robin, and it's about chronic fatigue syndrome. And when you have chronic fatigue syndrome, certain days you don't have that much energy. On some days you have more energy, but you always have to kind of conserve your energy and never go until you're like doing too much on a certain day, because the next day you won't have as much energy. And so if you think about that, that translates really easily into games, because it's technically like an energy bar kind of mechanic. And so that's exactly what this game kind of portrays. You can choose to make something to eat or to do some work, and then you have this kind of energy bar, and it makes you realize that you really have to like practice like self-care and really like limit the things you do and choose the most important things, because you can never like achieve everything you've set out to do in a day because of chronic fatigue syndrome. And that leads me to microgames as self-care. So as a summary, going through the process of thinking differently about things, going through this kind of game design lens and trying to figure out what mechanics to use, it can become a self-care process, because you have to deconstruct your experience and try to figure out what the important parts are, how they interact with each other, and this can help you become more self-aware and just like process the experience, as I mentioned before, with like just cathartic uses. And one example of this is this game that I made called Yearly. So I usually make games to help me process what makes me anxious, because sometimes I'm like, oh, there's this one specific thing that makes me anxious, but actually that's just like a symptom of something else, and there's different things that play within each other, and it can be really confusing. So I made this game about like time passing. So the idea is that you meet up with friends every year because you live in different countries. You meet with your high school friends, and you have this clock. And the idea is that you can talk to people and the clock ticks down, but you can never finish all the conversations with everyone. And at first, I didn't have the clock up there at all. I just kind of realized that I needed it to kind of communicate to players that there was like a kind of clock, like a clock mechanic, that the fact that the conversations ended not because you clicked wrong, but because you just had a limited amount of talking points available. And after the walls kind of crumbled down, because each year like the walls crumble down because, ooh, you know, emotions, and the clock still kind of floats in thin air just to kind of continuously give players feedback. And that made me realize that actually my problem, like what was making me anxious, was not like the social anxiety of talking to people. It was the fact that I like had a limited amount of time and that I couldn't like catch up with them properly. And so the concept of time passing was really like the core of my anxiety. So that was yay for me. Then Magic Squat House. So this was a big inspiration for Where the Punk's At, because it's about deciding to change your name to Cyanide, moving like to a weird place away from your parents, and being able to form a punk band, and then you can like play with the arrow keys, like different like cool tunes. And my point with this slide was that you can make big games like Magic Squat House if you want to. Like you can make the weird games you've always wanted to make. Like you can spare a few hours here and there, just use a really simple tool and just get things going, and you might feel better about yourself. You might get some game design skills. Like it doesn't have to be a structured activity if you don't want it to be. Of course, in the case of like self-care, you sometimes might want to have a more structured approach just to be able to process things better, because sometimes you might want to avoid things a bit and kind of cover them up. And I wanted to end, I think I've gone really fast, but yeah. This tweet by Robert Yang, which is, what if we made games about these fantasies, enjoying company of others, people being glad to see you, and being proud of someone else. So that was, you should make games about that. Thank you.